So we come to the fourth unit of the Old Testament overview, the Exodus. And this is a really exciting period when such a lot happened. Because what we see is a group of slaves, which really is just a very big family, in being given the instruments and the implements needed for them to become a nation. And so this period is from Exodus through to Deuteronomy. And you may be aware that there's much discussion about the date of the Exodus, but for our purposes, it's round about 1440 beyond there for about 40 years. And so when we come to Exodus, as we've said, we find a people in slavery and oppression. They are being exploited economically and physically, and being forced to build cities and make bricks and the things that are needed for that. And it was because this new king, we read, arose. And it was not just a new king, but a new dynasty. And they didn't recognize Joseph. And as I've mentioned, because the Israelites were a threat, they oppressed them. But God, in his purposes, brought about the birth of Moses, this male child that was protected and, ironically, not only protected, but raised in the palace of Pharaoh. As the story grows, we know that Moses spent about 40 years in the palaces of Pharaoh, and then seeing an Egyptian abuse an Israelite, he killed the Egyptian, and when that was known, he fled to the land of Midian. And there he married and for 40 years became a shepherd. God met him, you'll remember, at the burning bush, and despite his protests, God called him to be the one to lead his people out of Egypt. And so he returned, and gathering the elders of Israel, he told them that God had come, or had sent him to deliver them from slavery. And then we have the 10 plagues. And it's helpful to know that these 10 plagues were being used for a number of things. Firstly, they were demonstrating to Egypt and Pharaoh that the God of the Israelites was greater than the gods of the Egyptians. Because each of those plagues were not just judgments, but they were judgments against the gods of Egypt. For example, the blackness of the sky was a judgment against Ra, the sun god. And the Nile turning to blood was a judgment against the gods of the Nile, as they saw the Nile as the life-giving source for Egypt. And when it turned putrid, it no longer brought life. And other plagues too, whether it was frogs or against the cattle, or in fact all of them, were a demonstration that the God of Israel was greater than the gods of Egypt. It was demonstration to Israel too. When Moses went to the elders, they asked him, "Who is this God that sent you?" And Moses had already asked that question at the burning bush, and God had answered, "I am the I am." And so as the covenant God of Israel was about to deliver the people from Egypt, this people that had embraced the gods of Egypt, they were given a demonstration of the greatness of the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob over the gods of Egypt. And they could see that the God who was going to deliver them was indeed the one true God. And of course we have too the Passover inaugurated. This was the final judgment. The final judgment would be against Pharaoh himself, as the one who was deified, indeed his firstborn and the firstborn of Israel, if they did not have the blood of the lamb on their door, it did indeed die. But this Passover, this ceremony became for Israel the equivalent of Independence Day, the day when they celebrated their freedom from slavery in the land of Egypt. So they are set free. And as you look at the map, we see the traditional route of the Exodus, where they cross the Red Sea and go to Sinai. And at Sinai is in the Sinai Peninsula there, as it's called today. And of course there's a lot that happens there, as we will see. After a couple of years there, when they receive the implements of nationhood, they then make their way to the Promised Land, where they fail. And then 38 years later, they have, as it were, a second opportunity to go into the land. And the second generation, as we will discover, enter the land that God had promised Abraham so many years before. Some have suggested an alternative route, and the route is that they come to the Red Sea, and they come to a place opposite Midian, as it was, and that Mount Sinai was in fact in Arabia. Now, interestingly, the Apostle Paul says that in Galatians, in talking about the allegory, he talks about Mount Sinai in Arabia. And one of the reasons is there's a place there in Nuweiba. If you look at that satellite photograph, you can see a path through the mountains onto a beach, and then the sea in front of them. And the Exodus says that when the Egyptians decided to bring them back to slavery, that the Israelites were trapped with the sea ahead of them, the mountains each side, and the Egyptians behind. And some have thought that this is the route that they went. When you look at the Red Sea at this particular time, you can see in that cutaway that it's actually very shallow compared with the rest. There's like this underwater shelf, and when the seas were brought back, that is what the Israelites walked across on. Also, you see a photograph of what some have claimed is a chariot wheel there, that is a photograph taken from this area. So maybe this was the route. But either way, what we see is that it was at Mount Sinai so many things happened. And so in the wilderness we get the birth of a nation. And it's in Exodus 19 that God enters into a covenant relationship with his people. And we have what we could call Israel's commissioning. Because here God says, "It is you that I have brought up out of Egypt on eagle's wings, and I have brought you to myself. Even though all the nations of the earth are mine, you will be to me a holy people." And that means set apart for God. And there God says that they will be a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. And as you know, a priest is one who represents the people to God and God to the people. And even as Israel had a priesthood, and that is what happened, so it was God's intention that there would be a time that Israel as a whole nation would indeed be like a priesthood to the nations of the earth, and that the nation of Israel would represent the one true God to the nations. And we're going to see this again and again through Israel's history. Now, sadly, they seldom reach that ideal. But here we see, when we go back to Genesis 12, it was God blessing Abraham that indeed through him the nations would be blessed. And it was God's intention that through Israel they would indeed be a representative or a missionary people in the earth, a nation that worshipped the one true God, demonstrated his glory, and indeed a place where the nations could come to encounter the one true living God. And so it's here in the wilderness that God enters into covenant with Israel, and this becomes their constitution. Now, the kind of covenant he enters into is, we know today, it is a suzerainty covenant or a suzerainty treaty. This was a form of covenant that was well known in ancient times. It was when a more powerful king would take over a weaker nation, and rather than simply annihilating the people, the powerful victorious king would enter into a covenant with a defeated king, and then that king, defeated king, and his people would be part of the empire of the victorious king. The Hittites, the Assyrians, the Babylonians, and even Israel themselves would use this form of covenant when conquering nations. And the defeated king, known as a vassal, would have to agree to many stipulations of faithfulness to the victorious king, the suzerain, including, of course, paying tribute and supporting the suzerain when he fights and goes into battle, and many other things. Now, God used this particular form and cleaned it up, and he became the benevolent, wise, loving, and merciful suzerain, and Israel became his vassal. And the laws that he gave Israel, unlike the laws of the suzerainty treaty, the laws God gave Israel were only for their good and only for their benefit. And therefore God said, if you obey my covenant, you will be my chosen people and my special possession. There's different covenants in the ancient world. One is called a Parity Covenant, that is between equals. That's a kind of covenant Abraham made with Abimelech when they entered into a peace treaty. There's a Promissory Covenant, which is a one-sided covenant. This is what we see in Exodus 15, when God, with himself, promised Abraham the land. And we have this flaming torch and fire pot representing God moving through the pieces of the animal. And this is literally cutting a covenant, something that was traditional at that time. You would take an animal and cut them in half and walk between the pieces, and you were saying, in effect, if I break my side of the covenant, then you should do this to me. And if you break your side of the covenant, I will do to you what we've done to these animals. So this is truly a very solemn thing. And then we have the Suzerainty Covenant. This is when the greater makes a covenant with the lesser, and the vassal really has no choice of the terms of the covenant. They simply can agree or disagree. If they disagree, of course, they will be executed. So they usually agreed. As part of the covenant, we have what we know as the Ten Commandments. This I like to term as a Magna Carta of freedom that God was giving Israel, and it became the big 10 stipulations of the covenant. We should have no other gods. In Exodus 20, God begins by saying, I am the God that brought you out of slavery, out of the house of bondage. And because of that, I want you as a people to remain free. And the way you remain free is by worshipping me. Worshipping other gods will bring you into slavery, because you see, the gods we worship determine our worldview. And the worldview of any nation ends up becoming determining how that nation functions, and the values of that nation, and the form of justice in that nation, and the value they place on the poor and the vulnerable. And so God begins, no other gods and no idols, because no idol can truly represent me. Do not misuse God's name. That means if you make a vow or a promise in the name of God, you should keep that vow and keep that promise. And in a world where contracts were not often signed, but more one's word was given, it would be given with a vow, and that vow would be in God's name. And if that vow was broken, and so God's name would be brought into disrepute. God wanted a nation where people could be trusted with their word. Do not observe the Sabbath. God instituted rest, that this was unique and different. The fact that rest not only for the people and their children, but also their servants and their farm animals, their working animals. God wanted people to work hard, but to rest well as well. Surely this is one of the greatest contribution to workers' rights, we could say, because in many nations this was not considered, this was not part of their life. And so we could really say we have this law to thank for the concept of a weekend. Without this, there would be no weekend. Honor father and mother. These are the first authority figures that we meet, that children meet. And as they learn to show respect to authority of their parents, so they learn to show respect to other authorities in society that God has set up. And this is important for the existence of a healthy society. And what we want is strong families. What God wanted was strong families, and this is part of that. Do not murder makes a statement about the sanctity of life and the value of human life. This is not talking about defensive warfare, and it's not talking about the state execution. If a state had that, it's talking about premeditated murder, the selfish taking of life. Do not commit adultery. God's desire was that the sexual energy of a nation should be channeled into family and into the relationship of marriage to bring about strong marriages and strong families. Strong families brings about strong community and strong society. Do not steal. God's affirmation that in his nation private ownership should be honoured and respected. It's been shown how corporate ownership, shared ownership, often means no one takes responsibility. But when we own things ourselves, we value them and work for them and protect them. Don't lie is really do not bear false witness. In God's society, he wanted the law courts to be places of justice, places where one is able to obtain justice and see justice met. Therefore, do not bear false witness, do not commit perjury. And lastly, do not covet. God's heart wasn't just that these laws would be outward, but rather they would be embraced inside people's hearts and lives as a nation. They wouldn't just keep the law, but they would understand how good the law is and how beneficial it is for their society. And so after the Ten Commandments, we have all of the other laws. We understand from the rabbis there was 613. Other laws, 623, including the Ten Commandments. And we find them, the different themes of these laws, all mixed up, which was the custom of law giving in those days. There's another example of a law code on a large piece of stone in the Louvre in France. It was from an Amorite king a few hundred years before Moses, whose name was Hammurabi. And the laws of Hammurabi show some similarities to the law of Moses. And one of those similarities is that the laws are not in categories. And we do find that. We find all different kinds of laws, which today we would put in the kind of categories we have on the screen. One category, one of the most important, was religious laws. Israel had grown in Egypt. They had been in a land of idolatry. How should the religion of Israel happen? And we have laws about sacrifices and special days and holy days, and the kind of lifestyle that Israel should embrace. We have laws concerning the priesthood and their function and what they should and shouldn't do. We have what we would call criminal laws today. What should happen if someone is murdered? How should that be conducted? How should the law courts be conducted? What kind of justice system should they have? What should happen if someone steals and is caught stealing? What should happen if a business transaction goes wrong or someone is injured through fighting? We have what today we would call civil laws. What happens in the area of divorce or in the situation of polygamy, which was occasionally practiced? What happens when the first wife and the firstborn is out of favour? Can the husband decide to give the inheritance to the children or the firstborn of his second wife? And the answer, of course, is no. And so these laws are not the highest that God would want. Indeed, in Mark 10, we read that the divorce law was not what God wanted, but it was because of their hardness of heart. These laws are there to protect. Now we have a group that I've called hygiene or medical laws. Certainly these would not have been categories they would have thought of. This has to do with the laws of cleanness and uncleanness, and they were, in their thinking, connected to the sanctuary and how they should prepare themselves for the sanctuary. But what we find, understanding modern day, that these laws would have helped to keep the people of Israel very healthy. We think they had sanitation laws, that they should bury their feces when they have had a bowel movement, for example. And we think today how many nations would benefit from a better sanitation. We read that if a dead animal comes into a cooking pot, that cooking pot should either be broken if it was pottery, or it should be cleaned thoroughly if it was metal. That God didn't want the people of Israel to live in a house that had mildew on the walls. We find that if people had a contagious disease, they should be separated from the community. Laws which would have brought health and strength to the nation. Even safety laws. Laws that meant if you dug a hole, you should cover it so that someone doesn't fall in it and break their leg. Or if you build a house with a roof that you would live on, a flat roof, you should put a fence around it so people don't fall off. In other words, you should take reasonable precautions for the safety of others when you are responsible. There's laws regarding economics. Israel was not allowed to lend at interest. Land, which was the means of production, could never be sold. It could only be leased. And then connected to that, and debt could not last for more than 7 years. But the debtor did have to try very hard to repay their debt, even if it meant a bonded servitude. Social laws whereby the vulnerable in society still had the ability to have food. Every 3 years the people put aside some of their produce in their towns to be kind of like a food bank. And especially the widow, orphan and foreigner. Those most vulnerable should be protected. And these laws, we are assured in Deuteronomy, were not arbitrary, not burdensome, but all of them were for their own well-being, their own lasting good. In other words, this benevolent, merciful, wise suzerain was creating a constitution that if Israel had obeyed the laws, they would have had a rich and blessed society where all are protected and all have an opportunity to grow and to prosper and to be blessed. So, just reiterating, God wanted Israel to be a kingdom of priests, a missionary people, demonstrating the goodness of God. And in Deuteronomy 4 we read that if they obey the law, the nations around would look at Israel and say, this is a wise and discerning people. Which other people have a God so close to them as this people do? And in this they would then be a true witness of the one true and living God. And one thing the law reiterates regularly is that the foreigner and the stranger are welcome in Israel, and they should be treated well and treated with dignity and respect. And so the book of Exodus speaks about deliverance and Israel becoming a nation. Leviticus speaks about a holy God how a sinful people can approach a holy God, and how the holy God is able to relate to a sinful people. Right at the end of Exodus, God said through Moses, create a tabernacle, a sanctuary for me, that I may dwell among you. You see, this was God's desire, that he would dwell among the people. And at the end of Exodus, the glory of God fills the newly built tabernacle. And so the next book naturally deals with how the priesthood should relate, what their job is, and how they should function. And that's what we have in Leviticus. Numbers, we find them on the threshold of promise. They finish up receiving the laws and then they march again. Numbers gives them the order of how they should march, but come into the promised land. This first generation, out of fear of the Canaanites, refuse to believe God to take them in and conquer the land. And so we have 38 wasted years. And then it's not until we have a new generation they begin to conquer the lands on the east of the Jordan and are then ready to enter in across the Jordan into the land that God has for them. At Deuteronomy, it's with this new generation. It's in the form of a covenant, as you will see when you study Deuteronomy. We will not take time, because you're going to study this book in greater depth, but just to say it's in the form of the ancient Suzerainty Covenant, and it's also Moses' last speech, and there he preaches with a passion to the people, and it indeed becomes the foundation of the remainder of the Old Testament. Everything that happens from this point onwards relates back to this book, Deuteronomy.